JV was talking about, like, if we define it as, you know, banks holding reserves so that they can loan out new notes or back a currency. No, I don't think so. I don't think we'll go back to every bank having their own banknotes. I think it's maybe a decent analogy is making the mistake of thinking that the email, like the systems of email and how we interact with it and how often we use it are going to look like how we used physical mail. Like, that's not a good analogy. They're not the same systems. We're going to treat them very differently because they're very different things. And because of that, I don't really see central banks adopting it as reserve, except probably in a transitionary period where they're trying to prevent their currencies from collapsing, and the only thing that they can put in their reserves to bolster the confidence of their currency in the meantime is Bitcoin. But that will basically be the nail in the coffin, proving that we won't need their currencies anyway, and it will eventually end up there.
Ugly, what do you think about that? How do you see central banks potentially buying Bitcoin? Because as the case with El Salvador, I personally would have rather seen them fill their treasury and central bank with Bitcoin instead of announcing that it's legal tender. I would have rather seen it that way. I would have seen them go the MicroStrategy's route than the fiat currency. So do you think there is a central bank that is seriously considering buying Bitcoin for their reserves? And what would the ramifications of that be? Globally and locally.
I really pretty doubtful that it'll happen. I mean, so far they're not holding the Bitcoin that they confiscate. Now, I'm sure that they probably have some kind of reserve there that we don't know about. But, you know, I just don't think it's that important, because I think the driving force, you know, with the strength of Bitcoin is, I think Jimmy nailed it, it's going to destroy, hopefully, it's going to change what a world reserve is completely. And I don't think it's the people's world reserve. And it is our way to escape from fiat and central banking features. So I think that's the unique thing with Bitcoin. It's going to compete with fiat. It's you know, I'm not opposed to it be adopted as cash. I'm not opposed if it becomes a stable unit, but I don't see either of those things on the horizon, at least in the near term. And you know, like I'll go back to Hayek, and he said, no, it's going to be producers and merchants so that they can price. It's a yardstick, guys. There's Bitcoin and there's the standard, and they are two different things. The standard is a yardstick, it's a governance, and that's the Bitcoin is going to act as a governance over sovereign nations, which I think is great. That's my view.
All right, Jimmy and then Knut, what about you guys? What do you see? Do you see a central bank buying Bitcoin for their reserves anytime soon? And what does that do locally and globally?
Well, so let's go back to the function of a central bank, right? Let's go back to first principles. The whole point of a central bank is to be a bank for other banks. The reason why they exist is because, you know, one bank would go insolvent and then need help from the other ones, and then if they didn't get it, then it would go bankrupt, and then all the depositors would lose. So essentially, if you have a central bank, then you have liquidity amongst the banks, and no single bank will sort of go default. You have to essentially, the entire system has to go down in order for things to happen that way. It's the lender of last resort. It's a way in which you can expand the money supply, and it's usually controlled by the government of any given country. Now, the interesting thing about central banks is that in a free market, it wouldn't exist. The only reason central banks exist is because of the monopoly that a government has over it. if you had competing central banks, what would happen is banks would join the one with a higher reserve amount. So if one had a reserve of 10% backing their currency and another had 20%, as a bank, you are incentivized to go to the one with the 20% because they're going to be more solvent. And if you have one that's 20% versus 30%, then you go to the one with 30%. Eventually, you get to one where that's fully reserved, which is no different than being, having honest, sound money. So the only way in which it works is by having a monopoly, and this is why there's only one central bank per country, because if you had competing ones, then you would essentially end up with sound money, which governments don't want, because they want the ability to print lots of money and bring new money into existence. So at its core, it is a morally deficient, like stealth taxation thing that exists for that purpose. So when you have Bitcoin, I think it becomes sort of like a competing central bank that's actually sound, right? Because if you fractionally reserve at all, you are in danger, as you should be, because you are not solvent. If you're not solvent, you shouldn't be a business. Those are just the laws of economics. So in a sense, this whole concept of central banks like buying Bitcoin, they could, and it'll probably be better for them and let them exist a little longer. But I think long term, it's just sort of a band-aid over a broken, corrupt system. So you're going to end up on a Bitcoin standard regardless. So I think central banks are kind of dinosaurs that are going to go extinct, and the asteroid is Bitcoin.
Before there were central banks, there were actual banking clearing houses. That's how it started. And it wasn't until we nationalized it. and we have the same thing similarly today. Your commodities exchanges are like clearing houses. You're a member of the exchange. You are all financially responsible. If there's a problem on the exchange, it's the members that bail out the failing party. And so the retailer does not get hurt. This is sort of the same way before we nationalized the relatively free banking system that we had. It was a banking clearinghouse. So it is the very fact that we nationalized what was working so well where these problems really kicked in.
Yeah, and they did that because they wanted to print money for themselves, and it was a stealth taxation move. And they gave them a monopoly because they realized, okay, if you have competing central banks, you're going to end up with sounder and sounder money.
But a lot of people oppose central banks and always have.
Yeah.
And we always have. That's another issue. But central banking is the problem.
Guy, what are your thoughts on this?
I think central banks are going to fight for survival. They each have currencies that, let's take the context of looking at El Salvador, looking at Latin American countries and African countries that have essentially had monetary dependence on some hegemon somewhere else, some foreign power that they have no representation over, they have no power over. They just get screwed with whatever inflation, whatever overnight interest rate change, and their economy takes the brunt of it. Those countries and those societies are not going to, they're going to have so much benefit from adopting an independent currency that simply isn't controlled, simply isn't politically manipulated. And all of them together, somebody in Tonga may have absolutely no political relations with El Salvador at all. But when they both begin to use or become tied to the fate of Bitcoin, they essentially become a joint, an allied force of monetary independence against whatever hegemon, whether it's the Francophone, whether it's the Franc and French system in Africa, or whether it's the US dollar hegemony. And when we're talking about reserve, when that power of just disparate countries who have no affiliation whatsoever can actually bolster an independent currency and they don't have any loss, they try to make their own currency to compete, they're always going to be a tiny fish in a giant pond. But they don't have to, they essentially don't have to limit themselves to that being their only option anymore. And so when we're talking about like reserves, you know, using the copyright giants as an analogy, is BitTorrent and the inability to stop the transmission of information essentially forced them into a huge fight. They tried to shut down every centralized service. They shut down Napster, and it turns into this enormous battle, but it just slowly comes to a point where you realize that the transmission of information is so easy and costless that somebody is willing to transmit or copy a file to 1 million people for free, that they try to pretend it still costs like $20 a disc, and it just doesn't. It's not the reality anymore. And because of that, after a decade of fighting, they essentially had to concede. You know, Steve Jobs goes into the place and says, you're going to lose your dominance, you're going to lose your relevance, everybody is going to download your song. The question is, do you do it one at a time and give the user control and let them pay 99 cents a song, or do they get it for free? That is your question. And I think we're going to see that same sort of dynamic happen in money, where all of the reserve, all the central banks or whatever, they simply, to bolster their fiat, they are going to need Bitcoin on their balance sheet for the same reason that still to this day, they're actually still raising gold on their balance sheet. And I think that's going to be a big part of the concessions as they realize that Bitcoin is the value player on a global scale that's incredibly difficult to deal with and doesn't have, you know, doesn't have a central bank that they can push on, doesn't have a country that they can, you know, screw with the elections of to make sure that they have a friendly regime, and it's just going to be a thorn in every single thing they do, and eventually it means that they're going to have to buy it, and then they're going to have to, I think they're going to have to give up the way they think about control and use of the system in the same way that the copyrights just said, okay, everybody's going to be able to download their media everywhere, and there's nothing we can do about it.
All right, so these panels are generally one-sided, so everyone's in agreement that the concept of Bitcoin is going to destroy the concept of central banking. So what would this transition look like? Let's go back over to Jimmy. Like, do you think, what kind of havoc would it wreak? Or is it going to be nice and peaceful and everything's going to go well? Or, like, we don't know. And, like, how are people going to react to this when their central bank fails and the European currency may break up? Like, what happens? How do you see the future here?
Yeah, so the sad thing is we're probably going to see some form of hyperinflation start popping up, and it's not going to happen in the United States or anything. It's going to happen in, you know, the poor countries first. So we're kind of seeing that right now. Nigeria and Turkey, and of course, like Zimbabwe and Venezuela are long gone on hyperinflation. But this is what's going to happen first, and you know, those countries are going to be the quicker to adopt Bitcoin. A lot of the people in those countries like go and dollarize, right? They go and get the dollar. But as that starts to degrade and they see the returns against Bitcoin, you know, they're going to go towards Bitcoin a little more. And especially in places like El Salvador, where you have you know, an infrastructure of Lightning that's already there, and they're just going to use Bitcoin instead. And you're going to see, like, sort of like country by country, slowly Bitcoinize, and like maybe there's a transition step to dollarizing first. And as more of those countries Bitcoinize, then, you know, you're going to get more demand for Bitcoin, and the price, of course, will go up. But ultimately, what's going to happen is more people will come on the Bitcoin standard. And it'll be interesting because it'll sort of start with the small players first, and then there will be some sovereign that's on the bigger side. I don't know, maybe out of Asia or Europe or something like that, that'll say, you know what, I think I'll go. We're seeing where this is headed. We're going to go off the dollar and we're going to go into this. That might cause war. That might cause some strife. But yeah, I mean, there's going to be civil unrest along all of this stuff, and it's not going to be pretty. But you know, that's kind of what's happened every single time. You know, there's been a major transition of you know, what we're calling the world reserve currency, but really what we're talking about is the currency that people want the most.
Knut?
Yeah, something's missing there. The crash is coming, like hyperinflation is coming regardless of if Bitcoin exists or not. So Bitcoin just makes there be a transition at all. Otherwise, we would just have darkness.
Is Bitcoin speeding this up?
Bitcoin is probably speeding it up somehow, yes. I believe so. Willy Woo said something on your show the other week about an interesting fact about when you look at user data and the assumed users, how many Bitcoins they have in each address. So the number of people that have 1 Bitcoin or less, or 10 Bitcoin or less, is going up, while the number of users that have 10,000 Bitcoin or 100,000 Bitcoins or more, that number is going down. So what Bitcoin is doing is it's actually redistributing wealth by doing the exact opposite of those pro-redistributive wealth are trying to.
Yeah, it's amazing how wealth gets distributed better without government intervention.
Yeah, it's amazing because Bitcoin is doing in reality what the politicians say that they want to do, but do the opposite of all the time. Because the fiat system is basically, it's funneling wealth from everyone else into the pockets of the very wealthiest among us. And
The connected.
like the opposite thing of that. So which means that Bitcoiners are everywhere in every level of society and will have more and more influence as the network grows and as the number goes up. I believe I try to be an optimist about this, and I think we can transition quite smoothly because the old system will just become more and more irrelevant as Bitcoin grows, because there's a better way of doing things. Like it's not like Fujifilm put up a fight or Blockbuster put up a fight when they went out of business. They just vanished, and that's what's going to happen to nation states and banks also. I choose to be hopeful for the transition.
Ugly, how do you see the transition happening?
I'm rooting for you. Okay, in fact, I'm not quite as optimistic, but I do believe when you said it's the only avenue to have a smooth monetary transition. I think private money is the only way, but I do think that, for example, if you are like Knut or me or Tone or Jimmy or Swann, we have targets on our back. I don't recommend you do it that way if you can avoid it. There's no reason to, because I think it's going to be a very challenging time, and it's not going to be easy. And I think that you can be in danger, particularly. I think the United States is extremely in extreme danger, and I think actually third world countries or developing countries, I live here in Mexico. I know that if everything shuts down, the people here will get along fine. I have a hope. I'd love to see San Salvador become the new Hong Kong of America. It would be great. So I mean, I'm anxious. I want to get down there and see what's going on. So I do think that that's where the hope lies, and I'm not looking for it to come from the country I love.
Can you hear me? Did any one of you read Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker or Factfulness by Hans Rosling or any other book along similar book?
Any other book at all?
When you look at statistics across the globe, things are getting better everywhere. Even in the handicapped, free market, global society we live in now, with a lot of interventionism, things are getting better. Poorer people are getting less poor, and we have more material wealth than ever. poverty is almost eradicated from the globe due to the power of the free market, even though it's not as free as it should be at the moment. So I think people almost always have a too negative outlook on the future, and there's a reason for optimism. You can argue that this tool is so powerful, so you can afford to be an optimist, basically.
Another good book on that is The Rational Optimist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't read the book. I saw his TED Talk, and I really like his...
And Rosling. Rosling is another really good one.
Yeah,
Hans
it's a bit of
Rosling's
a comedy, but he's very good.
I gotta disagree a little bit here, because I don't know if it'll be that easy. I really don't. And
Oh no, I didn't get to my thoughts on the transition.
Go for it, guy. Go for it.
Trends, you know, and if you see, like Hans Rosling is a great resource for this because there's a really good video called 200 Countries, 200 Years in 4 Minutes. And it's just a collection of data of health, living standards, average wealth and wage, and like everything, productivity, all of this, like 5 or 6 like dominant metrics of just overall what's the state of the world. And there's just this, it's beautiful like visualization of the move over the last 200 years, and it's just nothing but straight up and to the right for every country, every population in the world. Even though there's a huge range, everybody's climbing towards wealthy, healthy, long life, high standard of living. And it's accelerated a lot in the last 30 or 40 years with the explosion of the internet and
all
technology.
communism.
But you also see these huge dips down that recover. You see the Great Depression, World War II, you see, you can even see like the 70s.
And you can see something happening in 1971, right?
Yes, you can see something happening in 1971. So there are definitely steps backward during that climb. But in the, like going back to whether or not the transition is going to be peaceful, how difficult has the battle and how messy has the battle with copyright been? And how much more powerful and how much more at stake do central banks and governments have in a fight with an independent currency that's global and has no borders?
Yeah, record companies don't have guns.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So I think we should be looking at it as what is the size of our multiple for how annoying and painful and what were the consequences of the copyright battle. And I think that's a really high multiple. But we're going through a monetary reset, whether Bitcoin is here or not. I think we just got profoundly lucky that Bitcoin landed when it did. We are at the end of a monetary cycle. They were going to need a quote unquote great reset, whether Bitcoin was here or not. But there is a portion of that, like when you've got a C, like you've got a condition where there are 10 shitty currencies, and one currency is the least shitty. That currency, even though all of the conditions are terrible, all of the imbalances are there, if there's no exit, if there's no real way to leave, and it's got $100 trillion, and there's no economy large enough to take that on, there's a point where the ship can't really sink because there's no way to get off the ship. Everybody who's in the 9 crappier currencies, their only way to bail out of their very fast sinking ship is to get on the slow sinking ship. So without an exit door big enough for the value to even leave, for the trust to completely collapse in the currency, is for something to actually be there to soak it up. I think Bitcoin is that thing. I think it's actually going to participate in accelerating this transition because it's an exit valve for all the pressure, and without one, we're just kind of stuck trying to bail out the Titanic as quick as we can before it, so it sinks slowly.
All right, Jimmy, your turn.
Well, so I think there is a huge capacity for violence, and this is something that we need to be very wary about. I've been studying, communist regimes and authoritarian regimes, and they are horrible. And if you do not want authoritarian regimes over you. Governments have killed more people than all the wars combined in the last century, right? Like, you can look at the Soviet Union. They lost somewhere around 5 to 10 million people to World War II. They lost way more than that because of the gulags, of all of the different things that Stalin did with the purges and all that stuff. So that, the thing that I fear is the coming authoritarianism, and I think CBDCs are definitely going to be a part of that, where it's going to be a surveillance state where they can pretty much do whatever they want to the citizens, and we're headed that way right now. I mean, I know the next panel is on coronavirus, and I'm sure you guys will talk about that, but this is a big trend that's very concerning and should be concerning, because it's very possible that if they're doing this for a virus, what are they going to do when it's about money? And this is where I disagreed with Lutz yesterday. He wants this sort of oppression and stuff because then Bitcoin will get stronger. Well, yeah, but that's a lot of stress for the actual holders. And this is what may be coming, and this is why, you want a little bit of a softer landing than us going to the gulag. That to me is a distinct possibility. It's going to be hard, especially in a country like the U.S. with a whole middle of the country that does not appreciate being told what to do. You got the coast that are much more compliant to certain things, but there's still sort of a live free or die kind of mentality among a lot of people. But a place like I think from what Giacomo told me, Switzerland. Yeah, they're going to that the compliant populations are much more likely to have significant upheaval and massive death at scales that we probably can't even imagine right now. But that's a possibility, guys, and that's something that we have to work towards not having happen.
Yeah, it's really incredible how the fate of the world actually depend on rural America and the ones that Americans have been making fun of for 100 years.
And guns, right? Having that, this what America was founded on. You're self-sovereign. You defend yourself. You don't
It reminds me of that Bundy Ranch incident where they tried to take away those farmers' land, and there was a big standoff. It was a few years ago. In Utah over the turtles.
Yeah.
It's insane.
But this is the sort of thing that we have to guard against, because this is the same power that's going to come against us when we have Bitcoin and stuff. And honestly, I think I've convinced myself that political activism is a worthy and necessary thing, even if extremely evil, because you could prevent a lot of death if you prevent this, Orwellian authoritarian future that is very possible with all of the digital tools that are available to a lot of governments now.
Yeah. I'm proud I was there on January 6th in Washington. And people on Twitter still
they hate you for it, yeah. They've been roasting you over the coals for it, yeah.
I'm proud of it. I was there.
The hopeful part, though, is that Bitcoiners are everywhere, even in politics. So, I hope we can infiltrate them before the gulags, because even the Wi-Fi is horrible in the gulag.
I think just in the context of political activism and stuff, I think our job and focus should be just to throw as many wrenches into the machine as possible. Just slow it down, get in the way, be loud at every turn, raise hell like the cyber hornets can raise hell, and anything that, normal political activism or trying to get your guy in office or whatever stupid thing. I think we're talking about devoting years or whatever of our lives to to changing the political apparatus, no, I think that's a horrible investment. I think that's a waste of our time. What we want to do is we want to build, we want to make sure that we have the systems that protect people in spite of an unfriendly political environment. But while they are trying to get their special interests, while they are trying to implement a law to support and protect the banks against Bitcoin and against an open, borderless monetary system that they don't have the reins on, that they don't get to charge a 5% remittance fee, and they don't get to delay it 3 days, and have their capital controls and their sanctions and all of that, while they are trying to re-implement that system on top of an open source, borderless network, we should at least be standing there to make sure that they don't. We should at least be pushing back against these bills, because that's what, 2 days worth of a couple of phone calls just to make sure that their lines are just blasted from, you know, morning to night, just so that they know we are here and that we aren't just going to accept it. And I think we should take the lesson from the cypherpunks. You know, they didn't sit down when the FBI labeled encryption munitions. They sued. They sued.
I'm going to take a little bit of issue with you, Guy, because I think there's that I kind of used to have your view, but I don't so much anymore, and the reason being is I think there's other precedents. Actually, during the Reformation, there was a similar issue where, you know, these relics and statues, we need to tear them down, and there was a careless, they went and they had this peasant revolt, and they tore them down. Whereas the other approach is you change hearts and minds, you educate, and you change hearts and minds.
I think that's more valuable.
And they come down on their own. Yeah, but the other one, I understand that, but the day, I mean, I agree with Jimmy so much. You do not want to live under this you do not want to invite it, and so the best way we can do is how we carry ourselves. And I'm not going to throw monkey wrenches, and obstacles. I'm going to try and develop new things. I want to bring something new to the table.
Well, so the fight is not in sort of like legislation and stuff like that. Surprisingly enough, the fight is in memes, in propaganda. Like this is where the main battle is happening, and you
make more memes.
And we're sort of going into the next thing right now, right? Like about coronavirus, but that's an excellent example. There's sort of like a narrative that is pushed by those in power to everybody else, and there's a bunch of people that swallow absolutely everything that is told to them, right? It's like, okay, masks are bad. Oh no, masks are good. Ventilators are good. No, they're bad. No, they'll just swallow whatever because that gives them safety. But there are other people that are like, you know what, that doesn't sound right. Do they actually know what they're talking about? But if I don't trust them, what do? I have to actually go learn things for myself. And the whole way in which it is said and how it is propagated, this is something that we've been kind of training for on Twitter for the last 10 years. This is going to come in handy. It is a battle over rhetoric. And that's where the real battlefield is going to be, especially in a democracy going forward. And not about, okay, let's put a procedure here so that they can delay it 30 hours on the Senate floor or something. Those tactics don't matter nearly as much as the propaganda, as the meme war, as the narrative, as the perception that Bitcoin is going to have going forward. Because they're going to flood us to death, guys.
Yeah, agree.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah. Hey guys, we're about to wrap up. We got about 10 more minutes. If anyone has any questions, come up to the mic.
Just a final thought there. Humans have two ways of resolving conflict. One is speech and one is violence. As Jimmy said, we're fighting a meme war here. We're preferring speech over violence. That's why we like Bitcoin, because we move money into the informational realm and make it unconfiscatable. That's what this is all about. We do it the civilized way instead of killing each other. That's the whole point.
Man, the unconfiscatability is going to be, hopefully that gets talked about more and more.
For your domain, yeah, I know.
Yeah, it's how I got into this. Alright, hey Gabe, I wanna, give me 1 second, I wanna record your question for Twitter. Once my last tweet finally posts, I need about 10 more seconds and then we'll get your question. Like, talk about doing 3 jobs at once.
Testing.
Yeah, that's the mic.
1, 2, 3. Good morning.
Alright,
Buenos dias.
I wanna post the tweet. There it is, alright, cool. Tweet, and I have another tweet. Alright, and 3, 2, 1, go.
My question relates a little bit to what Knut was just saying about speech versus violence. I'm kind of responding to some comments of Jimmy's about his overwhelming fear of violence in the future. So this is directed towards you, Jimmy, and anybody else who has a comment about it. How do you think that the surveillance situation will affect the possibility of carrying out violence on a grand scale? What I'm referring to is what I, as of 5 minutes ago, call Big Brother versus Little Sister, which is unlike in 1984. We live in a world of ubiquitous surveillance, not one-way surveillance. So we don't just have the Big Brother camera pointing on us, we have cameras that point on the great leaders. And examples of mass violence are far more difficult to carry out in secret than they ever have been. How do you think that situation, Big Brother versus Little Sister, affects authorities' ability to carry out acts of mass violence on the populace?
Yeah, and it is tricky in a society that's basically everyone has a camcorder, right? You're carrying it with you on your phone, and not only that, there's surveillance cameras absolutely everywhere. It was crazy, like for example, during the Boston Marathon bombing, they had all of these, like they basically tracked the people that carried out the bombing like the entire way through, because the streets of Boston were completely covered with the video cameras.
They say that that was all,
Yeah, but then
staged.
again, like if you think about it, like there's no security footage of Jeffrey Epstein, is there? So, like,
How do you know?
or it
We don't have
disappeared, right? Like,
yeah, word has it that there's.
yeah. So there's some, there are still things that they can do, and like it does depend on whistleblowers and things like that. But I think the more salient way in which the government can sort of carry out violence without necessarily murdering people is by restricting access. And we're kind of seeing that a little bit with the whole vaccine stuff, right? Like, okay, I think Tom tweeted out earlier today about how they're considering like no interstate travel unless you have a vaccine passport or something like that. Like, that's how you sort of like start oppressing people and say, okay, well, like you go to prison because that's the law, something like that. And then once you're in prison, you can get Epstein, right? Like, so there are lots of ways in which this could go, and we can definitely go towards a very authoritarian state. I still think that there's enough people with guns in the US where that's not going to be too big of a problem. But there are other countries around the world where that's not the case. And I mean, this very well may happen in other places where you do get Epstein in prison, or, there's just mass murder and no one really cares because it's not, talking about their Tesla stock or something, right? Like people are way more empathetic than we think because we're overstimulated.
Yeah, we saw that last year.
If you kill someone, you take 100% of the time. That's what you steal. You steal all their time. If you tax someone or impose inflation on someone, you steal parts of those 100%. So in a way, taxation and inflation are violence. They're the same thing. They're just like a light version of the death penalty, if you will.
Agreed.
All right, Patrick, you're up.
something which might be slightly controversial for this panel, but I've just kind of been thinking about this, one of the metrics of success or failure for Bitcoin. And in my mind, I think one of the ways that we can say Bitcoin has failed is if it cannot prevent a massive, catastrophic collapse of the world economy. If the worst thing that we get going forward in the next 10 years or so is something like what happened on January 6th, I think that's pretty much a peaceful transition. So would you guys agree with me that one of the metrics for Bitcoin failure is if it cannot prevent a massive, catastrophic collapse of the world economy? Then I think it has failed. What do you guys think about that?
See it more as a human IQ failure, not necessarily a Bitcoin problem.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's not Bitcoin's fault, it's everything else's fault.
It's our fault for not doing more conferences like this with a bunch of people in the stands and catering to, you know, the shitcoin conferences that can draw 10,000 people.
Also, like when you say massive economic collapse, I think you're talking about something like the Great Depression, something of that nature. The thing is, like, if you study economic collapses, like, as long as the government doesn't prolong it, it lasts like 6 months and that's it. Like that
Agreed. Yeah,
that tends to be the case. Like the reason why we had the Great Depression was because Hoover and FDR just had horrible policies that prolonged everything. In other places, you've had hyperinflation, and then like the government, like it collapses or something, or a new government comes in and they take sort of a hands-off approach. Next thing you know, 6 months later, everything's fine. And that the free market has this incredible ability to heal that we don't really give it credit for. So if by like massive economic collapse you mean like preventing something like the Great Depression, that's hard because you might get people in power that don't know what the hell they're doing and end up prolonging the depression, kind of like FDR and Hoover did. Or you might get, somebody that's more laissez-faire and says, all right, let it heal itself. It's kind of like a doctor, right? Like, first do no harm, and most of the time what you're doing is letting the body heal itself. Not like intervening. You're just giving it the right conditions so that the body will heal itself. If the economy was managed like that, we'd be much, much better off.
Agreed, Jimmy, but Bitcoin was supposed to be government hard and also idiot-proof. So, to Tone's point, so I think that if you can't resist incompetent government and low IQ people, then I think that would be measured for failure. I'd like to hear what Guy also has to say.
Can I just mention something, Jimmy, real quick? I agree with you on FDR. I don't agree with you on Hoover. So Hoover wrote like a great book, like his memoirs. Hoover was in the same position that Trump was. Like blaming Trump for the next 12 years because Biden and Harris, or mostly Harris, will be our president for the next 12 years. I fully expect him to step down, her getting reelected and reelected twice because they own the machines. And it's the same 12 years of presidency, identical to how Hoover had no shot. Like at the very end, like he was just like hopeless the way Trump was hopeless in the Corona situation. So just like I don't blame Trump for the current disaster that is happening with printed money, the same thing I wouldn't blame Hoover for what happened in 1929.
I would completely disagree, and I would read Rothbard's The Great Depression and his analysis, like what the Federal Reserve did at that time, and all of the loose monetary policies, and all of the stupid job programs, and building essentially bridges to nowhere. Like that prolonged the depression, and he did really. I mean, like FDR did even stupider stuff, but Hoover did plenty of very, very stupid things.
Yeah,
Jimmy, Hoover was a big part of it.
The idea that like Hoover was, when I was in middle school and taught all the brilliance of economic history on the Great Depression was that Hoover was laissez-faire and FDR came in and saved everybody with 10 years of poverty. And what's funny is that after, like I read an excerpt, I actually didn't read it in full, but it was like the memoirs of the top economic advisor to FDR, if I'm not mistaken. And he said that he just admitted, like, and the thing is like people kind of think that, like that was kind of like the political message, that they were like super different. He says, really all we did was like stack a bunch of stuff on top of it, but we just repackaged Hoover's plan and called it the New Deal. Like they just did the exact same thing that Hoover did while he was in office. And
It's kind of like Bush and Obama on foreign policy. They did the exact same
we're
thing,
so different.
even though they ran as completely different things. Yeah.
What was the question now?
That Bitcoin can be considered a failure if it doesn't prevent a total economic collapse.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, no, I don't think so. Because, Bitcoin can only really help the people who adopt Bitcoin. And when we're talking about monetary collapse, it's an inability to communicate information. It's like suddenly changing the definitions of all the words in the economy all at the same time and then trying to have a conversation with somebody. It just doesn't work. Everything breaks down and it results in a huge misallocation of resources. And going back to the idea of the Great Depression is that if you don't let the communication flow, you don't actually let the value correct and the prices correct, and you start manipulating, let's just artificially make this the interest rate because whatever, maybe that's gonna make things better and people will go into debt again, even though we're already 10x more debt than we have in savings. You're just destroying the very pricing mechanism you need to tell you useful information about our economic situation. So anybody who is staying in the fiat economy, even if there is a good enough Bitcoin corner, I guess you could say, of society that ability to communicate information isn't lost, there's still nothing you can really do about the other. If they still set interest rates and people are still using fiat money, Bitcoin can't do anything about people who don't actually use it as an escape. You can put a giant banner that says, this is the exit, please, orderly fashion, get out of the building, everything's on fire. But if everybody stays in their seats and the whole building goes up in flames, it's not the fault of the exit that everybody died in the fire. So that's my thoughts.
I just need to address how you posed that question, because you said, wasn't Bitcoin supposed to be this and that, and wouldn't it fail if so and so? Like, Bitcoin doesn't care what you think it's supposed to be. This is like the wrong viewpoint. It's here, it is what it is, and we can't change it. That's the whole point, right?
Right, it's not a
We can't
failure.
really judge if it has failed or not either.
Yeah,
It
it's
is
also,
what it is.
it's like the internet. It's not a failure of the internet that, everything is being censored right now to push a narrative. Like, it's not an internet's fault, it's literally the fault of people.
And the other thing that's kind of instructive to me, if you read When Money Dies, it's a really good book about the Weimar Republic and what happened with the hyperinflation there. There were people, even during the craziest hyperinflation, that were just waiting for it to go back up. That's gonna happen, right? There's gonna be stupid people, and you're not, Bitcoin can't save them because they're not taking the life raft. So, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
I choose to be the optimist here too, because I think Bitcoin is helpful to those people also, because of the way it will affect
Maybe, at the time, the farmers had these bumper crops, and the people in the city were starving. Why? Because the farmers refused to sell for, the depreciated currency, and instead, they just kept it back. They're like, well, I'm not selling it for this currency that's hyperinflating every week. So people in the city starved. It was crazy.
Bitcoin employs people, even though they don't have Bitcoin. We have, we have people that work for us that know little or nothing about Bitcoin, but their jobs is because we're on Bitcoin. So there is a responsibility there.
Yeah, at some point, if you need to eat, maybe you will get Bitcoin, and maybe it'll be sort of like the economic salvation of an economy like that.
All right, guys, we're 5 minutes over. We have to go ahead and wrap it up. It was a great discussion. Thank you very much. Some will stick around. Guys sticking around. Ugly, you're going to stick around as well. And we're going to talk, we're going to switch gears a little bit. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be back. And since we already talked about fractional reserve lending, we're going to talk about some coronavirus and what's going on and how Bitcoin can maybe help.